Hi, nice to see you. Thank you, John. Poor guy. He thought he was going to interview me, and so he's been up reading the body of work, and I really owe him a serious drink later on. So that's a promise, John. Thank you to Mary, Theron, everybody involved, Dick, everybody involved in this festival. We were talking last night. I was here for the inaugural festival. I was a part of that, and I was telling a story earlier. Andre Dubus III was one of our gang. It was pretty lively. I left him at about 3 in the morning after the last night, leading a charge of drunken writers as he shouted, "Let's go steal a boat." And then at the last I saw them, they were headed for the harbor. So if it was your boat, I'm very sorry. Anyway, these festivals, culture in any place, as it changes and grows, gets built by people who build events like this. And we have the film festival next week. There's Kate and the project in September. And it really is a wonderful thing. And you'll look back 10, 15 years later, and you see a whole world that didn't exist before, and each thing feeds the others, and we can only be grateful, especially these days. So I want to start by describing two events 45 years apart in the life of a woman. It's this woman. And of course, she's not just any woman, but she was the daughter of Joseph Stalin. So in 1967, and this is just a picture from a few years after that, when she was 40, just about to turn 41, and she defected from the Soviet Union 14 years after her father's death to the West. It was obviously one of the most momentous events of the Cold War. She was and remains, and her name was Svetlana Alliluyeva, which was the second name she went by in her life. The first name was Svetlana Stalina, and then after her father died in 1953, she took on her mother's maiden name, Alliluyeva, and then after she came to the States for reasons that you'll find out if you read the book, she became Lana Peters. So she was and remains the most significant Soviet citizen ever to defect to the West. And to give you just a little window into the effect that had on the world, that event at the height of the Cold War, when she arrived at JFK at the end of April, walked off the plane, there were more press and more people there than there had been for the Beatles 3 years earlier. And 4 days later, at a press conference at the Plaza Hotel, there were 100 members of the press from 115 different countries. It was live satellite feed all over the world. The memoir that she had brought with her, called 20 Letters to a Friend, which she had written in 1963, was sold its worldwide rights for $1.5 million at the time, which was second in publishing history only to the memoirs of Winston Churchill. And when it was published a few months later, it became an international bestseller. So just take that for a moment and set it aside. 45 years later, perhaps somewhat less celebrated moment. I'm in my sweats in Brooklyn, 2011, November, in the morning. I go downstairs to get the newspaper, the New York Times, actual paper, outside my door, and I pick it up, and there on the front page, in enormous type, is the headline, "Lana Peters, Stalin's daughter, dead at 85. Well, I'm perplexed, surprised. I hadn't thought of her in many, many years. I didn't even know she was still alive. I start to read. On the front page, there is a photograph, a now iconic photograph, you'll see it in a little bit, of Joseph Stalin in the mid-1930s with his military peasant tunic, holding a girl who's about 8 or 9 years old in his arms. He's sort of smiling at her, and he looks as though he might be about to kiss her cheek, and she's looking up at him from his shoulder and smiling up at him. And the word that comes to mind, at least for me looking at that photograph, is tender. And I believe that it's not a lie, that word, which doesn't mean it's the whole story, but we'll get to that in a moment. So that photograph is in the obituary, and the first paragraph of the obituary, the writer says that Svetlana's life was so extraordinary, it reads almost like a Russian novel. So I'm intrigued, reading away. I flip the page, go to the inside, full page, and there in the middle is a photograph, another photograph that stops me in my tracks, because I recognize the photograph. It had been hanging on the wall of my house while I was growing up, from the time I was 2 years old, and I recognized the people in the photograph. It's on the tarmac at JFK, and there's Svetlana on the right, and you can see the 1960s microphones, and on the left is my father. So he was then 34 years old, and he had been sent in the middle of the night under CIA cover to fetch her from Switzerland, where she had been waiting for weeks after having defected in Delhi, to see whether the United States would accept her. She'd been waiting under armed guard because in a convent there was some serious concern that she might be assassinated on Swiss soil by the Soviets. And you might ask, why was he sent to go fetch her? Senior partner at his law firm was a neighbor in Princeton of George Kennan, the great Russia diplomat and scholar, one of the intellectual fathers of containment as a theory. I read his famous cable from signed X when I was in college. And his neighbor in Princeton was senior partner at my father's firm. And Kennan realized, having received the original manuscript, a copy of it, of her memoir, which was written in Russian, and read it, he saw it as currency to help get her into the country and a very important document. And he turned to his neighbor about getting it published. So my father was drawn in to this. None of the old guys wanted to go to Switzerland in the middle of the night under CIA cover, so they called him, and he was sent over with a false passport, and he was met in Basel by a member of the Swiss intelligence community who put him on a train to Zurich, made sure he got on the train and did not get off the train. My father was quite concerned and nervous at this point. This was not his line of work. And he was sent to Zurich and then put into a hotel in the middle of the night where there were no other people. So it's sort of, imagine The Shining, but with a Swiss cast. Jack Nicholson, but very polite. So he was rather freaked out, and he didn't sleep much. And then at about 6 in the morning, dressed in a new shirt, same suit, he goes to the Zurich airport, and there in a back room with more security, he meets the daughter of Joseph Stalin. And she is wearing exactly this outfit. And they talk for a bit, and then they are put on a plane in first class. Those were the days. It's not like book tour, I have to tell you. And they immediately order martinis. My father orders 2 martinis for both of them. They are traveling under the names of Mr. and Mrs. Stalin, which is, that's a Swiss humor again. I hope nobody here is Swiss. I love Switzerland. And they take off. Nobody knows who she is. And about halfway through the flight, my father is summoned to the cockpit by an enraged Swiss pilot who has just discovered on the radio who is on his plane. And so he goes back to the seat knowing that by this time the word is out all over the world. And it is just during those hours, the second half of the flight, that all those people out there gather at the airport. They order more martinis. And while they're making the last leg of the journey, Svetlana turns to him at one point, puts her hand on his arm, and tells him that he reminds her of her beloved brother Yakov. Now, we will find out a little more about Yakov in a minute, but it is an indication, I think, an honest one, that by the time they arrive in New York, in a world in which she now knows no one and has left everyone behind, including 2 nearly grown children in Moscow, that my father at that stage, in that place, was the closest person to her in this new world. He was her lawyer, her friend, and closest advisor, and he would remain so till about the mid-70s. And after that, he would no longer be her lawyer. She was an incredibly challenging client, safe to say. But she would write to him for the rest of her life, for good reasons and bad. And when I began to work on this, I got the file of all of these letters and many other documents that he had had. He just retired last year at the age of 85. So those two events and that journey were the beginning, and that obituary, because after reading the obituary, I began work on the Red Daughter the next morning. Now, there were two things that sort of sat on the wall, or the metaphorical wall in front of me all these years while I've been working on the book. Sort of like, it's the economy, stupid. It's the thing you have to keep coming back to, you know, and each book has its own version of things you put up on your wall. One of them is just a fact. It's definitely not a novel, it's just a fact. And it's not even that surprising unless you begin to chew on it in a different way. And that is that Svetlana Alliluyeva was the daughter of a man responsible for the death of 20 million, well more than 20 million of his own people. So you think about that, something that wouldn't necessarily surprise us now, but you have to think about it maybe from the point of view of somebody who was his daughter. Number two, and this is a description, still not a novel, but a description. She would spend her entire life searching for a home and searching for a sense of self that she could recognize and inhabit, and trying to show the world and herself that she was not her father's daughter. She would never succeed, but she would never stop trying. She died at 85 in 2011, just outside of Spring Green, Wisconsin. So again, we have to think about the fact that she never stopped this pursuit, and that the pursuit itself, that journey and survival in some way were linked inextricably in her life. And the sheer persistence of that effort, to me, carries its own kind of wonder. So there you have these two things, both of which are interesting to me, but again, neither is a novel in itself. And you have to say to yourself, if you're the writer and you decide that this is what you want to do, and you're interested, how are you going to get inside? How are you going to get inside her lived life, her experience? How are you going to get inside that endless pursuit, that search for home? Because of course, a novel, that's what novels do. That's what they do, I believe, better than any other art form, is they deal with the interiority of lived life, lived experience of character. And you have to find your way in somehow. So to me, I looked at it and I thought, after reading for weeks and months, reading that would go on for years, research and all that, dozens of books, I thought there were two possible points of access. The first had to do with her voice. Now, there's a good biography written of Svetlana, just for example, about 5 years ago, called Stalin's Daughter by Rosemary Sullivan. And it's a good book that deals with the sources really well, has great empathy for her, and it's rather straightforward in how it handles the material. I, of course, devoured it, stole from it wildly. You know, I was that was my kind of book. And same time, as the book neared its end, I felt more and more sorry for the author, because I felt that she was yoked to this voice of Svetlana's, a voice that was, especially as she changed mostly from expressing herself in Russian during the first half of her life to expressing herself more and more in English in the second half of her life, as she aged and as a series of extreme, sometimes catastrophic decisions in her life began to mount. That voice, I came to see it as a hand that gradually turned into a fist that over the years became more and more like a clenched fist and ever more clenched. And you could see it in the letters that I saw from my father's file. You could see over the years, more and more words would be capitalized and underlined and exclamation marked. And it was this sense of a kind of almost a fury of primitive expressions. And I came to feel more and more as I learned more about her life that this voice was not commensurate in some way in its expressiveness with the life that I had come to understand that she had led. Now, novelist arrogance, I give you that, no question. I think I can come up with a better voice for her than she had, okay. But yes, so that's one thing. Number two was this photograph. The idea of not the person himself, but the idea of the role of this person, this young lawyer who is plucked out of his own existence, sent over to become the messenger and confidant of this person, the daughter of Joseph Stalin. At the height of the Cold War, bringing her in to this country that has such expectations for her, and trying to be in the midst of not only her own kind of blunt charisma and attractiveness and her courage, but also on the other side, how the country saw her and the excitement of that time, and then gradually the lack of excitement, the frustration, the disappointment, and then the forgetting. And whereas my father and Svetlana's relationship really only lasted just under 10 years, and they were certainly never romantically involved, I wanted to take that idea that's expressed here in this photo and to extrapolate it over the rest of the years of her life to try and create a window, if you will, for us to have sympathy for her, because she was a very difficult and challenging person often. And also, in the end, perhaps for her, to allow her to have more sympathy for herself. So, if you think about this and these access points and you say, well, how am I going to structure this book? That was the first 2 years, trying to figure out that. So if you open this novel, you are met with an editor's foreword, and it is written by a lawyer now in his 80s named Peter Horvath, and he immediately throws you into how he learns about her death, having not seen her for some time in the paper, and then he takes you back to the moment in which he went and brought her and the whole context of that time. And then he tells us how a few weeks after her death, when clearly he is still rather stunned and grieving, he's alone, he's widowed, and now he's really alone. Boxes arrive at his doorstep, and in these boxes are dozens of school journals filled with her handwriting in Russian. And these are journals that she has kept from the first day of her arrival with him in America until the end of her life. Now, these are fictional journals, I know, because I wrote them. And he then goes on to say that he makes it clear in a way that how he views this job, because he's her editor of these journals, which we are now going to read, which will be intermittently interrupted by editor's notes, which are his little parts of storytelling, if you will, about this journey that she took and also to some degree that he took. But he makes it clear that an editor is not what he is. Even a lawyer doesn't quite do justice to that, and that he's still trying in the time he has left to understand, who she was and what they were together. And then you begin, and we are in 1967, it's 3 a.m. of the night that she has arrived, and she begins to go back. She's trying to almost to understand now that she has arrived in this strange place, how she came to be here and how this all happened. She's 41 years old. Now, I'm going to take you back the way that she takes you back, and then we're going to come back to this moment of defection. And that's only about a third of the way through the book. And I really don't, what she goes on to do in her life, the decisions she makes, as I said, some of them extreme and catastrophic in her personal life, that touch on politics and history as we know it, I really believe that you can only understand those decisions when you go back and try and understand how she grew up and the emotional context of her life and that endless searching that she will go on for home and self. She was not a canny or savvy person. She was not political. She didn't care about money. She didn't even really understand money. She was a historical person by definition, but she spent her whole life trying not to be. Neither the CIA nor the KGB, in the end, could make any use of her. She was far too difficult, narcissistic, and caught up in this incredible journey of her own. And so you have to try and understand the emotional context of her life. The man on the left you will recognize. The woman on the right was Nadezhda Alliluyeva, Svetlana's mother, Nadia. The two of them had met during the revolution in Stalingrad, and she was his secretary. She was 23 years younger, and they married. And Svetlana was born in 1926, right around the time that Stalin was consolidating real power, 9 years after the revolution. By all accounts, Nadia was perhaps more committed to communism in some way than he was. She had not an ounce of maternal feeling in her. Svetlana could never remember being held by her. And at the end of Svetlana's life in this assisted living facility in Richmond Center, Wisconsin, where she was completely unknown by anyone around her, living on secondhand clothes. And there was one shelf that held several objects that she had managed to keep her entire life. One of them was a picture of the nanny who had raised her. One of them was a picture of Zubovalo, which is the dacha where she had lived with her family when they were all together, and her relatives and her grandparents, until she was 6. And the other one was a picture of her as an infant being held by her mother. And she kept it as proof that she had been loved by her mother, though she had no memory of it. She was raised in every way by her nanny, and then at the age of 6.5, she was told that her mother had died. She was taken in to Red Square in a public moment to see this casket in which her mother lay. And it would not be for 10 years when opening a British magazine and reading an article in English that she would learn that, in fact, her mother had not died of a ruptured appendix, as was said all over the country. Pravda barely noted her death, but in fact had killed herself after being publicly humiliated by Stalin at a state dinner. So she disappears. And Svetlana is 6.5. And then this is 1932. And this, of course, is that photograph I mentioned. And, you know, as I said before, I think it's not a lie. I think it's true. And if you were to ask me, after all the reading I've done about it, if she was ever happy, or if there had ever been any happiness in her life, I would have to say that it is during these years with one parent, who is Joseph Stalin, who is now at the very height of his power, cult of personality that infused the entire Soviet Union. And even though he was absent for months every year, and she was again living with and being raised by her nurse, that they would write letters to each other, and that the letters themselves, of which there are a couple of examples in the novel, represent a kind of genuine tenderness, intimacy, and almost innocence in their exchanges between father and daughter. He called her his housekeeper, his secretary, his hostess. He would demand in his letters that she give him commands and orders that he would then have to obey, things that she wanted him to bring her from Sochi, whatever it was. And then she would write back and give him the orders, and they would see each other every so often. He did not live with her. And if you ask, there are many accounts of this time in which people who were eyewitnesses and knew them well say that she was the only one who could soften his heart. The problem, of course, is that these are the same years in which, the 1930s, in which Stalin became Stalin. On the left is Vasily, who is her brother, 5 years older. He would be an alcoholic at 13, and by 20, a colonel in the Red Air Force. And eventually, after the war and after Stalin's death, he would be incarcerated for 8 years, and he would die of a kind of maniacal insubordination, if you will, at the age of 41. On the right is Yakov, the brother that she told my father he reminded her of. He was her protector. He was her half-brother, 19 years older. Stalin would not even meet with him until he was 16, and then only because Nadia forced him to. He bullied Yakov terribly, to the point where Yakov attempted to shoot himself in the heart one time, missed his heart, just injured himself horribly, and it allowed Stalin to tell him that he couldn't even shoot like a man. We'll get to what happens to Yakov in a minute, but during these years, this same person, and eventually she would know, not for a while, but eventually, this same father, the same source of the one love that she would ever really know, in a sense, but it would always come with an enormous asterisk, is the same Stalin that we know. He was the Stalin on a picture in every single room at the school where she went, in every single institution throughout the Soviet Union. He was the Stalin of the Great Famine, 1932 to 34, as many people here will know, took all the peasants, removed them from their land, put them on collective land, and 5 million people starved to death. The Great Purge, when any possible threat, anybody who would have or wanted or once had had power in the Soviet Union was essentially purged from any position of leadership in any institution, however small. The Great Terror, 1937 to 38, just as an example, 700,000 people shot, 1.7 million people incarcerated in Lubyanka and other places, and by 1938, there were 2 million people in the Gulag. Svetlana, many members of her own family began to disappear, either to Lubyanka, the Gulag, or shot. She didn't know, but she also learned not to ask. So it was during these same years that she would ever after, once she came in the mid-50s and later to understand some of what was going on, she would have to hold these two truths together. And they corrupted each other at some fundamental level. And so we're now getting into the war, 1941. The beginning of the war, Yakov, trying to prove himself, signs up immediately for a unit that's going to the front. He is sent immediately to the front, and he's immediately captured, the whole unit, by the Nazis and sent to a concentration camp. The Nazis will try desperately for a year and a half to trade him alive with Stalin for a high-ranking Nazi general. Stalin will ignore their pleas. At one point, they even dropped leaflets over Moscow suggesting the trade. And Yakov will die in the camp, and Svetlana will never see him again. The likelihood from accounts is that he threw himself on the electrified barbed wire and was killed that way. 1942, she's 16. That's Yakov when he's taken prisoner. 1942, she's 16. And she learns about her mother's suicide. It's 10 years after the fact, and she's at a party that Vasily has thrown, and she meets this man. This would have This is a picture of him about 12 years later. He was a very handsome, very well-known Jewish filmmaker named Alexei Kapler. And she meets him and falls in love with him, first real love of her life. And for the next few months, they carry on an affair. Whether or not, it's not even clear how physical it became, but it was a true affair, at least from her end, at least until she wakes up one morning in the apartment in the Kremlin that she shares with her nurse and finds her father, who was never around at that time, standing in a pile of torn, ripped up letters and photographs, everything that she had ever had from Kapler. And of course he knew. He'd found out about the relationship, he'd known about it from the beginning, and he slapped her across the face and called her a whore, and he sent Kapler to the Gulag, where he would spend the next 11 years until Stalin died. From that moment on, I think it's safe to say, and this is sort of the point of this arc, he never called her a housekeeper again, and that whole period came to an end. And now, as you go forward, you enter into a period where, if you're looking into her life, you see a wandering. And she's both, in some senses, trying to isolate herself, in other senses, just wandering, because what love she had known, however corrupted, is now gone, and she's out of that circle. She will see him again, but she is never again going to have that intimacy with him. And so you see this, 1945, she marries the man her father doesn't want her to marry, a Jewish classmate of hers at university. They have a son. She names him Yosef. Stalin couldn't care less, doesn't see him, isn't interested. 1950, after that marriage has collapsed, she marries, in fact, the man Stalin tells her to marry. It's a disaster, but they have a daughter, name her Katya. Stalin is not interested. 1953, Stalin has a brain hemorrhage and dies. Takes 3 days. She sits by his bedside in the midst of incredible chaos, panic, and venality, while he gradually, unconscious, his body begins almost to decay from inside. This whole scene, by the way, of course, is in The Death of Stalin, the fantastically funny, brilliant movie by Armando Iannucci, which has a rather different tone, I will say, from my novel, but I recommend it highly. So he's gone, and she is left in this very bizarre position. She is the princess of the Kremlin, the most famous woman in the Soviet Union. And now he's gone, and she is trying to, in some ways, remove herself, but she cannot. And in 1956, the same time as this is going on, the best-selling perfume in the Soviet Union is still called Breath of Svetlana. 1956, with her 2 kids, her nurse, who has been nursing her own kids, Svetlana's 2 children, dies. It's a terrible loss. And then comes Khrushchev's secret speech, which we now know is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the facts of what happened and what Stalin's crimes really were. But nonetheless, he was denounced. The beginning of the crimes were revealed, and the unwinding of that cult of personality began. And you see her now over these next years, and the signs that jump out at you, at least if you're a novelist. 1962, in the middle of the night, she meets a Russian Orthodox priest at a cathedral outside of Moscow, and he baptizes her. And he tells her that God loves her even though she's the daughter of Joseph Stalin. 1963, she writes her memoirs. It's a good book. She wrote 2 other memoirs, ever less good, once she came to America. This one she wrote in Russian. And it is, you can see her toward the end reckoning with some of what she knows, which is not all of it. But really, it's an evocation of a lost time, of a childhood that did exist, but also a childhood that she needed to exist, or to believe existed. The time, the years, those first years at Zubovalo, when all of the family was together and her mother was alive and she was a little girl and her father was her father. And it's a powerful evocation of all of that. And it's rather emotional and in some places beautiful. And that is the book, of course, that she would use to help her get into the United States. So we're now, let's say, 66, end of 65, and she's in a hospital. She's in a hospital for something, and she meets there an aging Indian communist named Braja Singh, very wise, decent, kind man. And he's very sick, and she gets out, and she tells him, because they become close, that when he gets out, he should come and live with her and Joseph and Katya in their apartment on the house in the embankment. And he gets out, and he does come and live with them, and they are essentially, they're not allowed to marry because he's Indian. But they are essentially common law husband and wife, and a few months later, because he's very ill, chronically, he dies. She goes to the head of the Communist Party and asks to be able to fulfill the promise she made to him that she would take his ashes back to his people's village in India so that they could have a service. She is denied. She's denied for a while, and then suddenly, for no reason she can think of, except they're sort of afraid of her making problems, and they would just want to get this over with. They give her her passport back, and they send a government minder with her, and they tell her that she can go. She's never been out of the country. So it's going to be a 2-week trip, and she says goodbye to her children, and they all expect it, including herself, to be 2 weeks. And she gets on the plane with a government minder and others, and she goes to Delhi. She leaves the minder in Delhi and takes a train 600 miles down the Ganges to the Braja Singh's village, and there they give her a room, and she settles in amongst them. They've never heard of her as a person. They don't know anything about Stalin, and they don't speak her language. For the first time in her life, she is not Stalin's daughter, and she settles in there. And after a week or 10 days, she begins to feel as though something is happening to her that she did not expect. And she writes to the consulate saying that she's not well and she needs more time. And would they extend her stay? They don't have a lot of choice. She's far off from where they are, and they give her more time. She will do this twice more, continuing to extend her stay for reasons that are only coming to her as they happen. And as they happen, she's looking back more and more back at the place where she came from, where she is Stalin's daughter and only Stalin's daughter. And she comes to see that the cage in which she has been living in, which is the cage of her father's name. And she comes to see, she believes, that she is trapped in that cage, but also because of her, in that sense, her children are trapped in that cage too, and will always be trapped in that cage as long as she allows this to go on. She gets word from the consulate that her time is up. They will not extend her anymore. She goes back to Delhi. She is staying in a guest house of the Russian consulate. There is to be one last dinner for her, surrounded by all of these party people. Then the flight leaves the next morning, on which there will be many other minders this time to make sure that she gets on the plane and go with her back to Moscow. And she's in her room in the late afternoon. She sends a message saying that she has a headache, she can't go to dinner. And then she packs a small bag with the manuscript of her memoir. And she goes out not really having a plan. She gets a phone, calls a taxi. Somehow the taxi arrives. She gets into it without being seen. The taxi takes her 4 blocks to the American embassy. That's how close it was. She gets out, she knocks on the door. It opens, she tells them who she is and what she wants. And they don't believe her. Stalin's daughter. There's no one in the embassy who knows. The file on her is so thin, they know almost nothing about her. So the envoy is suspicious, and he begins to question her, and then finally he puts her in a room with pen and paper, and he tells her to write her story. She writes a version of her story. They send in a psychiatrist to evaluate her mental state. I found that evaluation in my father's papers. I've never seen it anywhere else. There's a little part of it in the book. It's pretty good. I recommend it as a psychiatric document. Then he has to decide what to do. They've cabled the State Department, but they're not hearing back. And it is the eve of the 50th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, at a time in history, you'll remember, of course, when the entire world seemed to be balanced uneasily on this knife edge of nuclear disaster. And the last thing you could argue that the American government wanted to do was to incite the Soviets by humiliating them in some fashion. While the message does not come back, it becomes clear that if Svetlana doesn't leave soon, she will not be able to leave, because that plane is going to be leaving for her in the morning and they're going to be waiting. So the envoy finally believes her. He buys 2 tickets on a plane to Rome for himself and her. They get to the airport, get on the plane, and the plane is delayed and sits there on the tarmac for 3 hours. And while that plane is sitting there, the word does come back to the embassy from the State Department. They won't take her. So luckily, they don't know that the plane is still sitting on the tarmac. They would have, of course, taken her off the plane and returned her to the Soviets. The plane takes off, goes to Rome, and from there to Switzerland, and there she is in the convent, and there she is at the airport when my father arrives that morning, and they get on the plane and go to JFK and arrive in America. So I'm going to leave you, that's, as I said, about a third of the way through the book, and I really don't want to ruin the rest, because I still find it incredibly surprising and shocking sometimes, the things that she went on to do, the decisions she took, the way her life went. But I do want to leave you with her on the tarmac and something she said. My father, of course, like a good lawyer, had suggested giving her words to speak when they were on the plane after the martinis, and she rejected his advice, always wanting to speak her own, even in English, which her English was actually pretty good, but still. She gets off the plane and says a few things, and one thing she said really stuck with me. She said, "I believe that one can feel at home anywhere where one feels free." It's a statement that in many other contexts is a very positive statement and one of hope. But in this context, knowing what one knows about her own life and how it went, and seeing this endless search for home, you have to ask yourself, did the daughter of Joseph Stalin ever feel free? And thus, did she ever feel at home, ever find a place to land on this long journey that was her life? Thank you very much. Do we have time for questions?
No one's coming after you.
Okay.
Take 2 questions.
Okay.
But then we'll, of course,
Yes.
book selling.
Okay, 2 questions, no pressure. Anybody? Don't be shy. Yes.
So I read the book. I loved it.
Thank you.
So fascinating. But I read it a couple weeks ago. I'm still wondering why you wrote it as a historical novel versus a biography.
So as I said, though I admired the biography of her, the more I read it, the more conviction I had about what I wanted to do. And I really felt that she couldn't get inside the experience of that person in such a way that it allowed me as a reader to connect with her experience in human terms, outside of the historical frame, so that her experience in that sense never became universal to me. And I think the job of the novelist is to investigate human experience under any situation. and to understand what it is that connects the most apparently extreme kind of situation. You could be the daughter of a monster, you could be a soldier, you could be any number of things, a criminal, a murderer, whatever it is, with experiences of people who apparently don't have such extreme biographies, and yet at the same time, the emotional narrative remains linked. And I wanted to try and understand what it had been like for her to live that life and make that journey. And I did not feel, even after reading the historical record and many others, that that had come through. And I wanted to make my own means to open a window into that. And so that led to what I said about creating a structure for the novel. And all I can tell you is, we get to the end of our books. It's a long road, ask our families. And you look back at it, and all you can say, you don't know whether it's any good, you're exhausted, but all you can say is, this, my impulse to do this, is that what I did? And does it still feel like that was the book that I needed to write? And I continue to be interested in this, and I continue to feel that I have a connection with that lived experience that I could not get any other way. So it's my job I hope to make you feel that as well, but that is how I judged it and what my reasons were. Thanks. Yes?
I'm reading it still, and I love it so much.
Thank you.
I can't read more than 10 or 15 pages at a time because I know it's going to end soon. So
Thank you.
I'm really the person dragging it out, and so I know you're being elusive about it.
Yes.
Part of it is I don't want to spoil it.
Yeah.
But vaguely want to ask you, as
Mm-hmm.
you proceed past the point where you leave us, how much of that is based on reality and it's real, and how much of that then is
By far the most fictionalizing I did was simply in creating the character of Peter Horvath. It certainly begins, and its platform is really very close to my father's actual relationship with her, except, of course, it was never, as I said, romantic. But it extrapolates over many years. It becomes a very emotional relationship, not an easy one. And I think they offer each other perspectives, in a sense, on themselves, and I hope the reader too. And it becomes, his editor's notes become almost an inadvertent biography or autobiography of Peter himself. She's the most exciting thing that ever happened to him, in a sense. So that is by far, that structure is by far the most fictional aspect of what I did. The trough of her life is very much the trough of her life. But, I think this is true about many novelists. I did a lot of research, but I'm really not, I'm interested in these details oftentimes as an emotional means to a further investigation, not as an end in itself. So to me, a fact of her life or a detail about something she was wearing or she was doing or who else was in the room or what books were on the table are things I'm interested in as a little doorway into a room that I would call a room of truth, but not necessarily of fact. And I want to get into that room and I want to make something that feels like the truth. And I base my sense of that truth on all the reading I've done and all I know about her. But essentially, this novel, there are many historical novels that want to give you everything about a period, the politics, the culture, the economy. This is not that novel, though there is a lot of history in it. It's set over many, many years. But essentially, it is an emotional and psychological experience of that time, because that is how I believe she lived her life and saw her life. And I wanted the novel to reflect that, which is not something a biography could do. I hope that answers your question. I hope you finish it. Thank you.